Chapter 6. The Historicity of Concepts. Section 1. Let me now try to pull together some of the major arguments of this book. Since my main concern has been with the fundamental concepts of historical materialism, forces of production, economic structure / relations of production, and superstructure, it is worth reminding ourselves to begin with how Marx himself regarded theoretical categories. Theoretical categories were not free-floating analytic devices, innocent of historical context. Rather, for Marx, quote, ideas, categories, end quote, are but, quote, the abstract ideal expressions of social relations. Indeed, the categories are no more eternal than the relations they express. They are historical and transitory products, end quote. Hence, quote, in the succession of the economic categories, as in any other historical social science, it must not be forgotten that their subject, here modern bourgeois society, is always what is given, in the head as well as in reality, and that these categories, therefore, express the forms of being, the characteristics of existence, end quote. Marx adds, with emphasis, quote, this holds for science as well, end quote. There is no theoretical Archimedean point from which scientific analysis could commence, which lies outside the history and societies of which historical materialism tries to make sense. For Marx, our categories of analysis inescapably partake of the social reality they seek to depict. They bear the stamp of history, end quote. This remains the case even for, and perhaps especially for, the most apparently pure and simple of abstractions, like the Hegelian concept of property, ostensibly, quote, the subject's simplest juridical relation, end quote, discussed in Chapter 3. Such abstractions always presuppose some definite, quote, concrete substratum. Similarly with the idea of the, quote, abstract individual, discussed in Chapter 4. Indeed, Marx argues that as a rule, the most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development. Indeed, Marx argues that, quote, as a rule, the most general abstractions arise only in the midst of the richest possible concrete development, where one thing appears as common to many, to all, end quote. Quote, simple categories are latecomers on the historical stage. The historicity of such analytic categories is not, however, by any means always apparent. They appear as, precisely, abstractions, concepts whose content and validity are not circumscribed by time or place, which may therefore be applied quite legitimately to the analysis of any mode of production or social formation. Marx questions this appearance of, quote, pure abstraction, and denies such universalistic pretensions. In the 1857 General Introduction, he considers this question at length with regard to the conceptual fundamentals of political economy. He identifies a persistent ambiguity of reference in economists' categories. The, quote, abstraction of the category labor as such, labor pure and simple, end quote, for instance, in one sense, quote, expresses an immeasurably ancient relation, valid in all forms of society, end quote. At the same time, Marx maintains that the concept, quote, achieves practical truth as an abstraction, only as a category of the most modern society, end quote. The concept labor becomes, quote, thinkable in such abstraction only in, quote, a form of society in which individuals can with ease transfer from one labor to another, and where the specific kind of labor is a matter of chance for them, hence of indifference, end quote. In Capital, Marx suggests that Aristotle was precluded from developing a concept of value based on labor because of the absence of the material presupposition. Quote, Greek society was founded upon slavery, and had therefore its natural basis the inequality of men and their labor powers, end quote. Elsewhere, Marx develops similar arguments to explain the physiocrat's limitation of the category of value-producing labor to agricultural labor alone, and Petty's restrictions of the labor theory of value to labor which produces gold and silver. The 1857 introduction draws this general conclusion. Quote, this example of labor shows strictly how even the most abstract categories, despite their validity, precisely because of their abstractness, for all epochs, are nevertheless in the specific character of this abstraction, themselves likewise a product of historic relations, and possesses their full validity only for and within these relations. End quote. Marx. Grundrisse. Though Marx briefly goes on to entertain the idea that, quote, the bourgeois economy thus supplies the key to the ancient, etc., end quote, by virtue of its provision of such abstractions, he severely qualifies this. It is not to be taken, he says, quote, in the manner of those economists who smudge over all historical differences and see bourgeois relations in all forms of society. One can understand tribute, tithe, etc., if one is acquainted with ground rent, but one must not identify them. Although it is true, therefore, that the categories of bourgeois economics possess a truth for all other forms of society that is to be taken only with a grain of salt, end quote. There is, quote, always an essential difference, end quote. Ignoring such essential differences leads to implicitly teleological approaches to history, in which, quote, the latest form regards the previous ones as simply leading up to itself, and always conceives them one-sidedly, end quote. Elsewhere, I've argued that subsequently Marx considerably hardened up these later reservations. In the 1859 critique, Theories of Surplus Value and Capital, he does not use historically ambiguous categories like labor pure and simple, but develops a new conceptual apparatus founded upon the scrupulous distinction of the historical and transhistorical reference of such notions. This is a systematic feature of the methodology of Capital. Thus those senses in which the abstraction labor does genuinely apprehend, quote, an immeasurably ancient relation, valid in all forms of society. Excuse me. This is a systematic feature of the methodology of capital. Thus those senses in which the abstraction, quote, labor, does genuinely apprehend, quote, an immeasurably ancient relation, valid in all forms of society, are grasped in the transhistorical concept of useful or concrete labor, labor which yields use values, products which satisfy human needs of one sort or another. This concept, incidentally, is no more void of social content than any other, but its content is what is genuinely a social universal. The, quote, material side, which all human labor possesses irrespective of its social form. Marx makes clear, however, as we saw in Chapter 2, with respect to his concept of the labor process, that such transhistorical categories are abstractions. They do not in themselves immediately or adequately describe any empirical realities. This is the corollary of their very generality. All human labor is useful, but it is never only useful. And no empirical form of human labor can therefore be sufficiently described by its useful features alone. Meanwhile, those senses in which labor is, quote, as modern a category as are the relations which create this simple abstraction, end quote, are grasped in the historical category of abstract labor. Labor which produces exchange values. Abstract labor is labor conceived merely as the quantitative expenditure of human labor, irrespective of the particular useful or concrete form in which this expenditure takes place. It is such quantitatively equitable labor, as distinct from the different and qualitatively incommensurable labors, which produce different use values, which is expressed in the relative exchange values of different commodities. The concept of abstract labor, unlike that of useful labor, which is merely the concept of what all human labor has in common, a class concept in my earlier terminology, designates what for Marx is a definite historical reality, a particular social form in which, quote, labor actually exists empirically, quote, labor which creates exchange value, end quote, Marx says, is social, quote, not in the general sense, but in the particular sense, denoting a specific type of society, end quote. The, quote, abstraction of labor, quote, pure and simple, from its multiple concrete forms, is, for Marx, a process that really takes place when, and only when, commodities are exchanged, and it is this feature of modern bourgeois society which alone makes an abstract concept of labor possible. And more generally, quote, labor is henceforth always specified in Marx's writings in one or another such form: wage labor, slave labor, communal labor, and so forth, save where, rarely, Marx is generally speaking of what pertains to human labor transhistorically. Political economy is correspondingly and repeatedly criticized for ignoring these distinctions of form in its conceptualizations. Indeed, Marx says of the concrete abstract labor distinction that the concrete abstract labor distinction is, quote, the pivot on which a clear comprehension of political economy turns, end quote. Quote, the whole secret of the critical conception, end quote. Use value and exchange value, or technical and value composition of capital, are similar distinctions of transhistorical and historical. The same analytic strategy is at work in Marx's clarifications of Smith's ideas on productive and unproductive labor, and Ricardo's confusions between fixed and circulating, and constant and variable capital. I have mooted this distinction of transhistorical and historical categories in earlier chapters. But I stress it particularly here, because it indeed does seem to me to lie at the heart of Marx's, quote, critical conception, and says much about what is most distinctive in his perspective on theoretical concepts. The categories of political economy, and of bourgeois disciplines more generally. It is not hard to see how similar arguments could be developed regarding the legal subject of jurisprudential theory, or the state in political theory. Systematically conflate the historical and transhistorical dimensions of their objects in ways that are doubly ahistorical. On the one hand, the specifically historical anchorage of these simple abstractions, and indeed of economics as a discipline, in bourgeois society is obscured. Quote, labor as such, something which for Marx has tangible reality only as a relation of capitalist society. The abstract labor which produces exchange values is falsely identified with what is universal. The useful labor which produces use values. The, quote, essential difference of abstract labor is thereby lost in its identification with its antecedent social forms. And on the other hand, a quality specific to labor in capitalism, its abstract, merely quantitative comparability, is equally falsely predicated of human labor per se. Though this double slippage, the historicity of the phenomenon, is totally obliterated in the unitary bland abstraction, quote, labor. This is the same kind of conceptual slide, of course, found in the various fetishisms criticized throughout this book. It is hardly surprising that theories built on such abstracted conceptual foundations lack all historical purchase. Section 2. As argued in Chapter 2, such fetishisms are not merely intellectual errors. They are, as far as Marx is concerned at least, grounded in capitalism's phenomenal forms. The ways in which the social relations of bourgeois society present themselves in the consciousness of its participants. Neither the social presuppositions nor the historicity of, quote, natural, self-understood forms of life, and, quote, like, quote, labor, commodities, money, or capital, are immediately evident in their appearance. Such forms seem, rather, to be natural, obvious, and universal, and are accordingly conceived in ordinary language and political economy in fetishistic ways, precisely as pure ahistorical abstractions. As we have seen, Marx persistently relates the abstraction of social phenomena from their historic integument. Marx speaks of the abstraction of the state, abstract labor, abstract individual, and so on, in ways that are too consistent and too frequent to be coincidental. To the particular social conditions of capitalist production and the world of fetishized appearances, the particular social conditions of capitalist production sustain. Reification is for him a real social process. It is, then, the nature of bourgeois reality itself. The discrepancy between bourgeois reality's appearance and bourgeois reality's reality is thus its real and its ideal forms, which render a scientific analysis of such forms necessary, and to which simultaneously makes the science necessarily a critique. To show capitalism's phenomenal forms to be mystifying is implicitly to reject the immediate, quote, social forms of consciousness and the theories and ideologies predicated on their plausibility, in which these forms are, quote, spontaneously grasped. Marx's own theoretical concepts, in short, are grounded in the critique of appearances, of, quote, natural self-understood forms of social life, end quote, and their corresponding categories. Having written on this at book length elsewhere, I do not intend to elaborate too far on or defend what I see as involved in this form of analysis. But briefly, I see Marx's critique, analogously to Kant's, as entailing an excavation of the conditions of, quote, possibility or impossibility, end quote, and therewith the, quote, origins, extents, and limits, end quote, of its object. Marx's object, Marx's severally declared starting point, Marx's object and his severally declared starting point is not production in general, but the specific social forms in which, in any given instance, productive phenomenon manifest themselves to our experience. Given his materialist assumption of, quote, correspondence between phenomenal forms and categories of thought, such an analysis of the conditions of, quote, possibility or impossibility, end quote, of forms themselves is simultaneously an exposure of the, quote, origins, extents, and limits, end quote, of the theoretical categories in which they are conventionally apprehended. Not only propositions, therefore, but the very terms in which they are framed, categories and concepts for Marx, have a truth value. Definition can accordingly never be a merely nominal operation, a difficult notion for analytic philosophy to accept. This idea would not be at all odd to a Hegelian. The conditions of possibility at issue will, for Marx, be a given set of production relations between people and to nature, related to a given level of development of productive forces, in my sense of both terms, what he calls the, quote, material groundwork or set of conditions of existence, end quote, of society, its, quote, essential relations. Marx's critique, he says in the general introduction, thus moves from the, quote, imagined concrete, the given world of phenomenal forms, to the, quote, abstract, the concepts of the essential relations which explain these forms. Equally importantly, however, the critique then moves back again to, quote, a reproduction of the concrete by way of thought, end quote. As Marx says of his procedure in Capital, quote, the various forms of capital, as evolved in this book, approach step by step the form which they assume on the surface of society, and in the ordinary consciousness of the agents of production themselves, end quote. I see this second stage of analysis as being above all a historical enterprise. Essential relations are concretized through a genuinely historical analysis of the actions of, quote, real living individuals, end quote, in which, in the end, they entirely consist. And this is this ultimately explanatory and demystifying level of Marx's theory. Let me exemplify. On, quote, the surface of society, end quote, in immediate experience, quote, capital, is encountered simply as a sum of money which then productively invested is capable of expanding that money's value. The mysterious formula, money, money prime, money becoming more money. Marx asks how this expansion is possible. Otherwise put, what conditions are necessary in order that mere possession of a sum of value grants access to surplus value? Marx's answer is furnished by the theory of surplus value. The increment, the surplus value, the capitalist profit, or interest, derive from the discrepancy between the value of labor power, variable capital, and the value added in the productive employment of labor power, which exceeds that of the reproduction costs of the variable capital. The possibility of this occurring stems from a unique capacity of the commodity labor power. More value can be created in labor power's productive consumption than labor power itself embodies. But for this process to take place, certain conditions are necessary. First, the society must be a commodity-producing society. This supposes a definite historical form of social division of labor. Second, labor must be, quote, free, in Marx's double sense, free from constraints of serfdom or slavery, and free of means of production of its own through which it could reproduce itself without entering the wage relation. Only then will labor power become a commodity. Third, the means of production must be constituted as the private property of capitalist employers. Only then will labor power have a buyer capable of profiting from labor power's unique capabilities. All of these, as Marx makes clear, presume a requisite level of development of the productiveness of labor. He concludes thus, quote, "One thing is clear. Nature does not produce on the one side owners of money or commodities, and on the other men possess nothing but their own labor power. This relation has no natural basis. Neither is its social basis one that is common to all historical periods. It is clearly the result of past historical development, of a past historical development, the product of many economic revolutions, of the extinction of a whole series of older forms of social production." End quote, Marx. Marx goes on from here to argue that capital is, in fact, a social relation. Contrary to capital's appearance, capital is, quote, "not a thing, but rather a definite social production relation, belonging to a definite historical formation of society, which is manifested in a thing and lends this thing a definite social character." End quote. He elaborates, quote, "A Negro is a Negro. He only becomes a slave in certain relations. A cotton-spinning jenny is a machine for spinning cotton. It becomes capital only in certain relations. Torn from these relationships, it is no more capital than gold in itself is money, or sugar, the price of sugar." Marx quotes the same passage again, evidently not having changed his mind in the intervening 20 years. Damn. Torn from these relations, it is no more capital than gold in itself is money, or sugar, the price of sugar. End quote. Marx quotes the same passage again, evidently not having not changed his mind in the intervening 20 years. I guess in 1867, Marx quotes himself from 1847. Capital is not then the means of production or money as such, but specifically, quote, "the means of production monopolized by a certain section of society, confronting living labor power as products and working conditions rendered independent of this very labor power, which are personified through this antithesis in capital. It is thus quote, command over unpaid labor, quote, a coercive relation, which compels the working class to do more work than the narrow round of its own life wants, prescribes," end quote. Recall here the German ideology's view of what is, quote, property. What Marx does here is to reconceptualize capital in terms of the essential relation which explains its phenomenal form, money prime, self-expanding value. In his own words, quote, severance of the conditions of production on the one hand, from the producers on the other, forms the conception of capital, end quote. This analysis is paradigmatic. Marx does the same thing when he argues exchange value, in appearance a property of things, to be, quote, a cipher for a social relation, end quote, or that thing-like entity, quote, the state, to be an abstracted, idealized form of class power. Ostensibly natural and universal, quote, self-understood forms of social life, end quote, are revealed as more or less mystified forms of historically specific relationships between people and reconceptualized accordingly. Instructively, to return to Cohen for a moment, Cohen denies that capital is literally a relation. Cohen says capital is a thing which has relational properties. This entails identifying capital with the things in which capital is materialized, albeit things which acquire the properties of capital only within particular social relationships. Cohen reasons that to say capital is a relation is akin to saying that a husband is the relation of marriage by virtue of which he acquires the relational status of husband. Here, as elsewhere, Cohen purports to express Marx's thought in a less, quote, untidy form than Marx himself does. But if Marx's formulation is thought confusing, I myself find it transparently clear. It would probably be more in accord with his intent to reserve the term, quote, capital for the essential relation at issue and use another word for money, means of production, the wage fund, commodities, and so on within the relation. For Marx, the latter are merely aspects of the capital relation, forms the capital relation takes in the course of its, quote, circuit. Marx's concept of capital includes wage labor. So, as so often, Cohen spectacularly, if elegantly, misses Marx's point. What Cohen sees as a rather irritating category error, the apparent confusion of a relation with one of its terms, is precisely the fetish Marx is analyzing. In this context, we might pause to note the significance of another issue on which, notwithstanding his avowed, quote, traditionalism and, quote, respect for, quote, what Marx wrote, end quote, Cohen chooses in passant to depart from Marx. Cohen attempts, he says, to state Marx's, quote, theory of history, end quote, in a way which involves no commitment to the labor theory of value. The labor theory of value may indeed have difficulties, but whether the labor theory of value can be so easily dispensed with in characterizing Marx's thought is questionable. For it is on the basis of that theory that the fetishes of commodity and capital are identified. Seeing value as a property of things is fetishistic only if, as the labor theory maintains, exchange value is in fact a manifestation of relations between people's labors. Coletti argues, quote, an organic unity, end quote. Between Marx's theory of value and his theory of fetishism, Rubin goes still further, claiming that, quote, the theory of fetishism is per se the basis of Marx's entire economic system, and in particular of his theory of value, end quote. Whether either can be coherently stated independently of the other is exceedingly dubious. Alternatively, we might say that Cohen's ability to write a book on Marx's theory of history, in which, quote, the theses of the labor theory of value are not presupposed or entailed, end quote, is as good an indication as any of how far his peroration does, quote, respect what Marx actually wrote. The labor theory, of course, may well be wrong, but that does not justify simply ignoring it in a purported commentary on Karl Marx. To come back to Marx's critique, having, quote, deconstructed immediate phenomenal forms into their constitutive relations, Marx now has a basis from which he is then able to go on to develop a historical account of what these relations in fact comprise. In the case of capital, for instance, an historical analysis, not informed by his prior critique, would remain blind to the historical significance of, say, the Enclosure Acts. So long as we remain at the level of appearances and continue to see capital fetishistically as a thing, the search for the origins of capitalism will be limited to such factors as the influx of precious metals, the material substance of money from the Americas into early modern Europe, the abstemious, quote, Puritanism of early entrepreneurs who saved and invested the supposed thing, quote, capital, or the development of industrial technology, capital's palpable embodiment. I am not asserting that any of these do not have their place in a causal account. Manifestly they do. But if Marx is right about what capital is, a social relation, the central historiographic problem must be the origins of the relation of capital itself. The processes which led to the, quote, decomposition of the original union existing between the laboring man and his instruments of labor, end quote. We need to focus on how those abstractions, quote, labor and, quote, property, were historically brought into being. Marx's critique, in other words, accomplishes a radical shift of historiographic terrain. Once capital is reconceptualized as a relation, not the thing it originally appears to be, we are directed to a buried history, that of class formation and struggle. The possibility is thereby opened up of moving back again to the, quote, imagined concrete of the surface of society, but this time grasped as, quote, a rich totality of many determinations and relations, end quote. Instead of operating with analytic categories which replicate the misplaced concreteness of reified forms, like value and capital, as conventionally conceived, we can begin empirically to recover the material ways in which, through time, these forms were constructed in the intercourse of, quote, real, living individuals, end quote. Marx is clear, we should note, that such historical inquiry is, quote, a work in its own right, end quote. We cannot deduce empirical specifics of social formation from its bare concept. This is important. Reification of the concepts of essential relations is as pernicious as fetishism of phenomenal forms, and by no means unknown to Marxism. Recovering, quote, the real history of the relations of production, end quote, is an ineluctably empirical enterprise. Thus, in Capital, in pages vivid with empirical detail, Marx brings, quote, primitive accumulation to life as a story of enclosures, clearances, theft of church property, vagrancy legislation, and combination acts. He traces the career of absolute surplus value and struggles over the length of the working day, and relative surplus value in, quote, the strife between workman and machine, end quote. A narrative of Luddites and factory acts, the history of class struggle. Class struggles, plural. Such, I believe, is the ultimate explanatory level of Marx's work, and what alone justifies its claim to be historical and materialist. Contrary to Cohen, Marx's concepts of forces and relations of production, of essential relations, do not then denote, quote, items, which are, quote, more basic than actions, end quote. The structure-action opposition is a false opposition. These, quote, items are actions, forms of human relationship, and the whole point of Marx's critique is to unmask them as such. Behind the authorless theater of fetishism lie, quote, real living individuals, end quote. For Marx, the true and the only subjects of history. I offer no apologies for this humanist lapse. It is rather time to stress the intimate connection between this critical analytical method and Marx's emancipatory commitment. He himself had no doubts on the matter. Speaking once again of capital, he wrote, quote, the economists do not conceive capital as a relation. The economists cannot conceive capital as a relation, so without at the same time conceiving the capital relation as a historically transitory, i.e., a relative, not an absolute form of production, end quote. But, quote, from the moment that the bourgeois mode of production and the conditions of production and distribution which correspond to it are recognized as historical, the delusion of regarding these as natural laws of production vanishes, and the prospect opens up of a new society, a new economic social formation, to which capitalism is only the transition, end quote, Marx. I would argue that the same applies to state law and all other social forms historical materialism analyzes. All that is apparently solid melts into air. All that is apparently solid melts, if not into air. And only in that melting that deconstruction of sedimented social forms into historical process, the actions of real living individuals, does the possibility of people getting, quote, exchange, production, the mode of their mutual relation under their control again, end quote. Human emancipation, as Marx conceived it, begins to look graspable. Section 3. Marx's understanding and use of theoretical categories is then intimately and necessarily bound up with his substantive historical sociology. His appreciation of the specific historical specificity of bourgeois society itself. Given his views and the material basis of, quote, ideas, categories, end quote, it could hardly be otherwise. Marx is, of course, not alone in his concern with the, quote, essential differences of bourgeois society, a preoccupation with the nature, origins, and consequences of what is modern in, quote, modernity has been a constitutive problematic of social theory from Adam Smith to Georg Simmel and beyond. Marx himself, as I have indicated at various points in this book, comprehensively contrasts bourgeois society with all that preceded bourgeois society. His major contrast at the level of social relations is between social orders founded upon personalized dependency, taking a multiplicity of forms in history, and the ostensibly impersonal, quote, objective dependency relations, end quote, of capitalism. The ostensibly impersonal, quote, objective dependency relations, end quote, of capitalism are historically unprecedented, at least as the basis for an entire society, and for Marx are what explain most that is characteristically modern in modernity. In bourgeois society, quote, abstract individuals dominate one another as, quote, economic classes, not social, political, legal estates, through the impersonal medium of property. Dominion over people is established through and expressed in command over things, above all, means of production and labor power. Cohen is right at the phenomenal level about what property is in capitalism. The essential relation behind this is a particular form of social division of labor, of which Marx analyzes class formation as an aspect. This relation constitutes the market as an apparently sui generis realm, governed by quasi-natural laws of the market's own, and standing over and against individuals, the, quote, economy, as ordinarily conceived. But a range of other social forms are implicit in, or internally related to, this. Though Marx's sociology of such forms is sketchier than his critique of the economic categories, he clearly identifies both the individualization of people within the private world of civil society and the complementary formation of a, quote, public realm, the, quote, political state, as part of this same nexus of relationships. Marx also locates key figures of bourgeois discourse, notions of individual freedom, human rights, formal equality, all of which have as their dual reference points the abstract citizen and the ideal community in this same repertoire of social forms. Other sociologies have picked up on this complementarity of individualization and state formation, and the connection of both with capitalism, and in some cases elucidated its phenomenology more thoroughly than does Marx. I think of Foucault and Elias, as well as Weber and Durkheim. Marx's distinctiveness lies in rooting the totality in people's, quote, materialistic connection, end quote. Though I have argued characteristically as forms of this connection itself, rather than as its epiphenomenal or secondary consequence. Weberian themes of the pertinence of individualist Protestantism to the bourgeois ethos, or the development of rational law and bureaucracy, or the more general cultural configuration of Zweckrationalität in the modern West, formal instrumental rationality, whose paradigm, as Weber is explicit, is the capitalist market, can evidently be addressed within this problematic. So can Durkheim's concerns with the moral foundations of social order in, quote, organic societies, the pre-contractual conditions of contract, or the relative relation between state formation and the sanctification of the human individual as the moral subject of the modern world order. Likewise, Zimmel's wide-ranging and insightful phenomenology in the philosophy of money of the lived world of commodity exchange and its connections with, to quote Siegfried Kracauer, quote, ownership, greed, extravagance, cynicism, individual freedom, the style of life, culture, the value of the personality, etc. End quote. But I digress. The main point I wish to stress here is that what was argued above for Marx's, quote, economic categories, quote, labor, value, capital, and so on, applies with equal force to his, quote, sociological concepts. I have provided ample evidence throughout this book to show that Marx himself was well aware that, quote, simple sociological abstractions, individual class, economy, polity, state, were no more devoid of historical anchorage and reference than a concept like labor. In, quote, the specific character of their abstraction, end quote. These two are historical categories. In one sense, just as with, quote, labor, the very abstractness of these concepts indeed does enable them to illuminate antecedent forms of society. We may, for instance, use the concept of class, as developed for capitalism, to illuminate what is involved in serfdom. Like the wage relation, the latter is a relation in which direct producers are exploited, contrary to its appearance as a relation of reciprocal patriarchal obligation founded in natural or God-given hierarchy. But this is not to identify the two, or to say that a feudal estate is a class in the same sense as the modern bourgeoisie. Once we make this identification, we lose sight of the specificity of both forms of society and the, quote, essential difference between them. For Marx, the bourgeoisie is the first true ruling class in history. And the bourgeoisie, being the first true ruling class in history, is a very important fact about the bourgeoisie, telling us much about what the bourgeoisie's social power comprises and the forms in which that power is constituted. In this sense, Laslet may be quite right to describe pre-capitalist England as a, quote, one-class society, as he notoriously did to much Marxist ear. Laslet's concern was not to deny the fact of inequality or exploitation, but to point to the absence of classes in the modern sense of the word. Likewise with the state. Of course, in a general sense, we can find similarities between governance in all societies. Marxists would concur that in most cases, quote, political power is exercised by those who command surplus labor. But it remains true, and it remains important, if that is, we are to understand how real societies actually work, that neither feudal monarchies nor the ancient polis, not Polish, nor, quote, Asiatic despotism were states in the same sense as the bourgeois polity is. We are dealing, in fine, with entirely different relations which take different phenomenal forms and demand appropriate and specific historical categories for their analysis. We need, then, to carry out the same sort of critique of the, quote, simple abstractions of sociology or political science or jurisprudence, as Marx himself did in Capital, of the elementary categories of political economy. We need to disentangle what is genuinely abstract and transhistorical in such concepts from what merely generalizes from the phenomenal form of the bourgeois life. And we need to be as sensitive to the possible illusoriness of the latter as was Marx himself. There is ample indication in Marx's work that this was his intention, even if his focus narrowed after the 1840s. Indeed, it is abundantly clear that Marx regarded the conceptual fundamentals of what have since become other bourgeois, quote, social sciences as quite as fetishized and, quote, idealistic as the abstractions of political economy. Marx was suspicious, in particular, of the related abstractions of the, quote, natural individual, end quote, whom we encounter in economics as the sovereign consumer, in politics as the voting citizen, in sociology as the meaning-giving actor, and in jurisprudence as the legal subject, in the, quote, ideal community, polity, society, law. Elsewhere, I have argued that Marx attempted to transcend the individual-society dichotomy fundamental to most sociology on exactly these grounds. Quote, abstraction, quote, idealization, reification were, for Marx, to say it again, intrinsic to the perverted logic of essence of capitalism. characteristic of the estranged, alienated ways in which bourgeois social relations manifest themselves to consciousness in all spheres of life. Arguably, it is just such reified forms which underpin and give phenomenal sense to the boundaries between modern social science disciplines. Boundaries which, insofar as these disciplines do succeed in penetrating beyond the quote, surface of society, end quote, they themselves comprehensively protest. Quote, the economy, itself one such reification, and perhaps the most bedazzling and spectacular of all, is far from the only production in this theater of illusion, nor is, quote, it itself explanatory of the mystification our social relations are. Historical materialism needs to be aware, as Marx himself, of the historicity of the analytic categories it brings to bear on the world. I mean this in two senses. First, it must recognize the origins of theoretical concepts in forms of experience. Which may, if Marx is right, be misleading. Though they furnish the necessary starting point for analysis, such categories may systematically misrepresent the reality they seek to depict. They are first of all explananda for historical materialism, an integral part of the object of investigation, not unproblematic theoretical resources. Before they can be used, they need to be critically interrogated and historically situated. Just as Marx did with the categories of political economy. Second, Marxism needs equally to be aware that there are historical boundaries to the legitimate employment of concepts and theories built upon concepts. We can no more universalize the concept of the state or property or the individual, appropriate to the phenomenal forms of capitalist life, than we can the concept of value or capital. Quote, simple abstractions, in short, are neither so simple nor so abstract as they at first sight appear. They always articulate, even as they obscure, some more, quote, concrete substratum. Dare I say it, some material basis. To some readers, the foregoing may appear banal and elementary sermonizing. But my central argument against much orthodox Marxism in this book, using Cohen as my exemplar, has been that it lacks precisely this sort of critical analytic foundation. It proceeds immediately from summaries like the 1859 preface, interpreting the concepts employed there in ways that are inconsistent both with Marx's substantive practice and the critical methodology which informs it. Impatient for certainty, for tidiness, for system, orthodox Marxism demands a theory of history, understanding by a theory of history something which is radically incompatible with a methodology within which substantive concept formation and explanation are ineluctably a posteriori and necessarily historically bounded. It is tempting to speculate on the reasons for this. Coletti suggests the influence of the late 19th century positivistic and scientific intellectual milieu, in which Marxists were constrained to combat ideologies like social Darwinism on their own terrain. I believe the transformation of Marxism into the official ideology of mass parties and latterly of, quote, socialist states to have had as much to do with this mutation of Marxism from method to dogma, not perhaps always directly, but more in the provision of an authoritative set of parameters for discourse, paradigms in Kuhn's sense, like the, quote, orthodox and generally unsubstantiated, taken for granted interpretations of Marx's basic concepts criticized here. Be that as it may, my immediate concern here is with what results. These standard interpretations of the fundamental concepts of historical materialism, I have sought to show, are exactly like the fetishistic concepts Marx criticized in Political Economy, and that they are built upon specifically capitalist appearances, which are then generalized. A determinate historical and fetishistic content is surreptitiously carried over into ostensibly transhistorical abstractions, apparent pure definitions. As with the economist's concept of labor, historical and transhistorical are conflated. That same double dehistoricizing is manifest, ignoring the concept's roots in a particular form of society, goes along with universalization of properties of that society under the guise of pure conceptual abstraction. Just like political economy, traditional Marxism endlessly moves in the charmed circle of, quote, natural, self-understood forms of social life, seeking to decipher not, quote, their historical character, for in its eyes they are immutable, but their meaning, end quote. Marx. Theories are spun through the philosophical ratiocination alone. There is simply no conception of the possible historicity of his own categories. The, quote, invisible threads, which connect the languages of philosophizing with the real world in a work like Cohen's. This historicity, as with the concepts of bourgeois thought more generally, may indeed not be immediately apparent because of the level of generality, precisely the apparently abstract, timeless quality of the categories at issue. But Marxists, with an inkling of concern for their mentor's method, should have been alert to it. I have argued the case in detail in chapters 2 to 4 for each of the three concepts, conventionally understood as separate, quote, levels of social reality, invoked in Marx's 1859 preface, forces of production, relations of production / economic structure, and superstructure, quote, traditional definitions, epitomized by Cohen, but far from confined to his work, or his functional determinist school of Marxism, are, I hope, I have sufficiently shown, founded in the universalization of what Marx at least analyzed as the apparent characteristics of these phenomena exhibit within the specific historical parameters of capitalism, at the same time as these categories are wholly abstracted from the historic conditions which give them birth. Thus, where for Marx productive forces were capacities of people in association, tradition defines the productive forces in their capitalist alienated appearance as things. Quote, those facilities and devices which are used in the process of production, means of production on the one hand and labor power on the other, end quote. Cohen. Where for Marx, production relations are, quote, the social relations within which individuals produce, end quote, which, quote, in their totality constitute what are called the social relations, society, end quote. An extremely broad conception. Quote, tradition founds the category on the notion of property as it appears in capitalism as a relation of ownership between individuals and things. Quote, relations of economic power people enjoy or lack over labor power and means of production, end quote. And where for Marx, the quote, superstructure is the set of phenomenal forms the quote, base itself assumes in social consciousness, whose quote, ideality in capitalism lies precisely in its appearance of separation from people's, quote, materialistic connection, end quote. Tradition takes this separation at its face value and enshrines it as a theoretical axiom. The subsequent construal of Marx's guiding thread as a theory of history, in which the entities thus defined are seen as externally and causally related, whether deterministically, functionally, structurally, or within, quote, relative autonomy models, rests on this initial reifying abstraction of these terms themselves. Having once sundered Marx's, quote, organic unity and constructed these fictitious subjects, the, quote, correspondences Marx posited cannot be restored. However implausible, however historically absurd, the attempt in any other way. The consequence of this fetishism of Marx's concepts is twofold. First, and most evidently, because this universalization of capitalist phenomenal forms is profoundly ahistorical, historical materialism loses all empirical purchase once we move outside of capitalism's parameters. This is well brought out in the anthropological work of Godelier and Meillassoux, or the historical studies of Thompson, Hill, Hilton, or Bloch. The conventional concept of productive forces sheds little light on how pyramids were built, or China irrigated, that of, quote, economic structure, of, quote, property, is of scant use for comprehending societies where surplus extraction is organized through personalized relations of kinship, Herrschaft, or civitas, and it is pretty meaningless to attempt to demarcate superstructures as, quote, non-economic institutions in historical contexts where a clearly isolatable, quote, economy itself does not exist. In short, for societies other than capitalism, quote, traditional historical materialism excludes by conceptual fiat from people's, quote, materialistic connection, much that it is demonstrably essential to it, and was, as I have repeatedly shown, freely acknowledged as such by Marx himself. This seriously jeopardizes Marxism's claim to be either historical or materialist in any empirically pertinent sense. It also thoroughly effaces Marx's own keen understanding of what is so distinctive about capitalist society. Second, and equally importantly, because of their phenomenal basis, traditional Marxist categories are of limited use, but like the concepts of political economy, have immense and immensely dangerous superficial plausibility. in comprehending the autonomy of bourgeois society itself. I would argue, for instance, that to construe productive forces as things, in this context industrial technologies, is to travesty Marx's own appreciation of the nature of the forces relations conflict in capitalism and its pertinence to socialism. For Marx, the contradiction between the capacities, ultimately of individuals, capitalism had developed insofar as it had socialized labor, and the restrictive forms this socialization took under the aegis of private property. Industrial technology is problematic for socialism in this view, precisely because it is simultaneously an embodiment of social productive forces and a materialization of oppressive social relationships, both a force and a relation of production. It cannot therefore simply be developed in the framework of a new set of property relations, like the nationalization of means of production, distribution, and exchange, to deliver socialism. Its very forms, the division of mental and manual labor, the hierarchy of authority and subordination, embodied in the social logic of production lines, are part and parcel of capitalist relations socialism seeks to transform. Braverman's work needs to be recalled. The same is true more broadly of capitalism's household enterprise separation and the definitions of, quote, work, waged work, labor, materialized in this social geography, its town-country separation, and the many other differential divisions of labor on which it rests. As I have argued with others elsewhere, traditional conceptions of what, quote, development of the productive forces, end quote, entails, have placed enormous restrictions on human emancipation in this century, when embodied in the planning strategies and very material apparatuses of ruling parties in post-revolutionary societies. Marx spoke of the violence of things. The violence of abstractions can be equally devastating. Similarly, to equate production relations with ownership and define capitalism's economic structure in these terms alone is to replicate bourgeois illusions as to what property is, an unmediated relation of individuals to things, and comprehensively obscure the wide range of relations, the labyrinth of forms and foci of social power, through which so apparently simple a thing as, quote, property is actually constituted, regulated, legitimated, and made natural and, quote, obvious, precisely, quote, simple. Foucault's work on the microsociology of power is pertinent here. So is the rich vein of modern feminist historical scholarship. Such forms of power essentially include, though they are far from exhausted by, that which we summarize as, quote, the state, and its, quote, orderly oppression of law, end quote, which traditional Marxism equally, and in defiance of the subtleties of Marx's own analysis, takes at its face value as an independently and ostensibly independent superstructure. Ironically, bourgeois radicals have been far more aware, for some time, of the imbrications of the, quote, non-economic in making capitalist economy possible and its naturalistic appearance passable, perhaps because for them it was always a practical rather than a merely theoretical problem. I have already quoted Adam Smith. For Jeremy Bentham, quote, law alone has accomplished what all the natural feelings were not able to do. Law alone has been able to create a fixed and durable possession which deserves the name of property. End quote. Smith, like Durkheim, also knew that contract had a basis in trust. That capitalism was, amongst other things, a profoundly moral order. The theory of moral sentiments, by Adam Smith, preceded the wealth of nations. Christopher Hill and Edward Thompson, amongst many others, and following Marx, have recovered for us the struggle of moral economies in capitalism's formation. But one could as well read Blake Elizabeth Gaskell's North and South, or come to that Disraeli's Sibyl for comparable enlightenment. In citing early sociologists of capitalism, for such they were, like Smith or Bentham, I am not trying to restore idealism. Law or morality were never for Marx independent of people's, quote, materialistic connection. The point is that for Marx, law was not a superstructure, as tradition understands the term, external to and causally determined by the economy, either. Rather, it is one of the myriad forms, the social relations, which premise that economy empirically take. Marx's achievements lie in comprehending law, like the state, as such a form, rather than in its ideal, abstracted independence. In this sense, he indeed does find the anatomy of civil society in political economy. This is a far cry, however, from traditional ideas of what superstructures are and how they relate to bases. It is also not without its implications for conceptions of socialism. The facile but enduring idea, for instance, that the state, in quotes, is the sort of, quote, thing which can be, quote, seized and, quote, used, and as Lenin once said, then thrown on the scrap heap of history, or even in the favorite apocalyptic Marxist image, quote, smashed. As a long and sad history from Kronstadt to Solidarity bears witness, this particular abstraction has been bloodily violent in its practical implications. Amen to that. A major casualty of traditional definitions of production relations, worthy of particular comment, is the concept of class, the centerpiece of Marx's sociology. For Cohen, class can be defined as, quote, a purely economic relation, which then obliges us to seek causal connections between this economic, quote, essence of the relationship and the real empirical forms which class identity, consciousness, and action actually take in history. Other Marxists, like Eric Olin Wright, give us ever more labyrinth schemata of the same ilk. In some justly famous remarks, E.P. Thompson has described such, quote, hypostasizing of class identities, end quote. Quote, when in discussing class, one finds oneself too frequently commencing sentences with, quote, it. It is time to place oneself under some historical control, or one is in danger of becoming the slave of one's own categories. Sociologists who have stopped the time machine, and with a good deal of conceptual huffing and puffing, have gone down to the engine room to look, tell us that nowhere at all have they been able to locate and classify a class. They can only find a multitude of people with different occupations, incomes, status hierarchies, and the rest. Of course, they are right, since class is not this or that part of the machine, but the way the machine works once it is set in motion. Not this interest and that interest, but the friction of interests, the movement itself, the heat, the thundering noise. Class is a social and cultural formation, often finding institutional expression, which cannot be defined abstractly or in isolation, but only in terms of relationship with other classes. And ultimately, the definition can only be made in the medium of time. That is, action and reaction, change and conflict. When we speak of a class, we are thinking of a very loosely defined body of people who share the same categories of interests, social experiences, traditions, and value system, who have a disposition to behave as a class, to define themselves in their actions and in their consciousness in relation to other groups of people in class ways. But class itself is not a thing. Class is a happening. End quote. E.P. Thompson. On the conception of social relations of production, which I have argued was Marx's, it could not be otherwise. Quote, economic classes are made, and can only then be conceptualized in their pristine, quote, economic purity. Quote, almost mathematically, so many men who stand in a certain relation to the means of production, end quote. Over time, and through a multiplicity of social media. A national parliament, the county bench, Magna Carta, Hakluyt's Voyages, and Fox's Book of Martyrs, suppression of disorderly alehouses, and regulated, quote, encouragement of, quote, rational amusements. All of these and much else were amongst the forms through which the, quote, economic power of the English ruling class came to be made, not its, quote, superstructural phenomenon. When Marx wrote that, quote, every social form of property has morals of its own, end quote, or, conversely, quote, the opposition between political economy and ethics is only an apparent opposition. Political economy expresses moral laws in its own way, end quote. It was, I think, this sort of, quote, nexus of relationships he was getting at. Marx was not remotely speaking of an external relationship between economy here and morality or legality or polity or civility there, as, quote, traditional historical materialism would have us ludicrously believe. It remains to say that none of this is to deny the centrality within historical materialism of the, quote, production and reproduction of real life. The issue is rather of what that production and reproduction entails, and how it may most appropriately be analyzed. Section 5. It remains to say that none of this is to deny the centrality within historical materialism of the, quote, production and reproduction of real life, end quote. The issue is rather of what that production and reproduction entails and how it may most appropriately be analyzed. My approach, I believe, opens up the possibility of giving what is empirically essential to people's, quote, materialistic connection, end quote, and recognized as such in Marx's own concepts and texts, greater centrality than any schema like Cohen's ever can. quote, traditional historical materialism, end quote, shuffles reified categories between which it posits more or less implausible connections at the level of a general theory. I argue rather for a minimum of a priori theory and the use of empirically open general categories which are analytically capable of letting the real world in. Thus, there are no theoretical obstacles of the sort which have occasioned entertaining contortions in recent years among Marxists to recognize cooperation as a productive force for nascent capitalism, or jurisdiction as a production relation in feudalism, which on any reasonable view of the evidence they surely were. The corollary is a commitment to an empirical method of inquiry, albeit importantly not an empiricist one, in which purportedly explanatory statements have in the end to be concretized historically as descriptions of the actions of, quote, real living individuals, end quote, and validated accordingly. Such a perspective is perfectly capable of producing rigorous and determinate concepts and theories, but it does so not at the level of some general theory of history, nor by virtue of philosophical virtuosity, but for substantive societies and on the basis of empirical investigation. I would argue that historical materialism can be determinate a posteriori to the precise extent that it eschews the temptation spuriously to foreclose empirical and historical questions by a priori speculative construction. Marxists may feel that this cuts them adrift. A characterization of historical materialism in terms of an object domain, quote, production and reproduction of real life, end quote, and a method of analysis, empirical history informed by critique, leaves few of the old comforting landmarks intact. The proof of the pudding is left entirely to its eating, and there's little left for the philosophers to do. But I see nothing as being lost and much to be gained by this strategy. We cannot, after all, establish any logical necessity for the primacy of production in the explanation of social life. It must remain hypothetical. Material production, including, I would suggest, production of human beings, is a reasonable starting point for a sociology, and one which has in the past led to substantive studies which have mightily increased our knowledge of society and history, including those of Marx himself. But we can no more conclude from the undeniable fact that there can be no social life without production, the consequence that the mode of production, therefore, determines any other area of social life, then we could conclude from the equally true and equally banal proposition that there can be no social life without language, the corollary that social structures are determined by the laws of grammar. No worthwhile piece of historical materialist sociology, or anthropology, or history would, in my view, resist methodological characterization. No worthwhile piece of historical materialist sociology, or anthropology, or history would, in my view, resist methodological characterization in the terms offered here. Indeed, the best and most innovative Marxist work has as often as not been accompanied only by abandoning, or at best paying only lip service to, the sacred cows of tradition. Consider Thompson's explicit rejection of the base superstructure distinction, and ask whether the making of the English working class could have been written otherwise. Or think about how far Godelier would have got in his anthropological studies had he not been prepared to jettison the standard reception of a, quote, economic structure. On my interpretation of the fundamentals of historical materialism, we can, without contradiction, respect Thompson's observations on the pervasiveness of law in the 1700s English society. Indeed, and the point should really not have to be argued among historical materialists. We can see this for what it actually is: an important gain in our knowledge of the, quote, material groundwork of that phase of English capitalist development, rather than a theoretical embarrassment, an unwelcome anomaly, or worse, a deviation from the biblical texts of the master. To add the kind of conceptual hygiene advocated by Cohen, on the other hand, would, I fear, land us up with no worthwhile Marxist work of any substantive kind at all. For to put it bluntly, the world is not as his theory requires it to be. Thankfully, perhaps, as Mark Bloch once remarked, it is no bad thing. The facts are there to remind us that society is not a geometric figure. Theory should be abandoned if it gets in the way of knowledge. In the case of historical materialism, I believe, we are better off without the familiar landmarks, for all too often they turn out to be mere Potemkin villages, impressive facades which block the view. Traditional historical materialism all too often theoretically preempts what can only be historical questions and should never have been treated as anything else. Marx himself, I believe, would have had little truck with such theoretical bubble blowing. Quote, theoretical bubble blowing. Though that is neither the only nor the best reason to leave it behind, but a last reminder of irascible old Nick's impatience with the poverty of philosophy will not perhaps go amiss. Quote, when reality is depicted, philosophy as an independent branch of knowledge loses its medium of existence. At the best, its place can be taken by a summing up of the most general results, abstractions which arise from the observation of the historical development of men. Viewed apart from real history, these abstractions have in themselves no value whatsoever. They can only serve to facilitate the arrangement of historical material, to indicate the sequence of the historical material's separate strata. But they by no means afford a recipe or schema, as does philosophy, for neatly trimming the epochs of history. On the contrary, our difficulties begin only when we set about the observation and the arrangement, the real depiction of our historical material, whether of a past epoch or the present. End quote. Marx, 1846.